and we will get started here today. So, if you're curious, this is our website, evidencemanagement.com. You can go there and find out all kinds of fun things, live training when we have it, a little bit about our services, and a lot about free online training. And there's a link on that website that will lead you straight to that. I'd also encourage you to look at our standards and best practices guide. That's something that we also available or we offer available. I'm tongue tied. It's online. You can find it there. And I would encourage you to read through those standards. And if you have questions, if you see things that are missing, if you see practices that you disagree with or you think are not applicable, I would love to have those discussions because the goal is to make those useful for everyone and responsive to the needs of evidence managers, regardless of where you are. So check that out online. Today is session 7. It is the last training session in our free online basic elements of evidence management training class. And today we're going to wrap up by talking about three different things. And obviously, this has been a cram course on evidence management. I think a really appropriate length of time for a class on evidence management would be 3 days. We do 2 days in our regular training classes. Uh, those could be expanded, but I think the most you can really expect people to sit through is 2 days. It's quite a chore, even if you're as engaging and and vibrant as I am. It's still a lot to expect someone to sit through. So 2 days is what we do, but there is always room for more. So also want to talk every session. I mean, the reason this is possible, free training isn't free. It costs somebody something, and it takes funding, and we've had the blessing of having an industry partnership with Tracker Products. Um, they are the reason that we're able to do this. So check them out. They're an evidence management software company. Check them out at trackerproducts.com. And I'd also like to point your attention to kind of what's next. Um, I have enjoyed this training and I want to see it continue. So we were going to launch a podcast, but what I think we'll still do a podcast, but we're gonna host it here in the same format. So if you've signed up for this class, you'll still be on the same class registration list for the evidence show, which will begin June 11th at 2 o'clock. So you don't have to do anything to sign up again. I would encourage you to let people know about it. What we're going to accomplish through the evidence show is deeper dives into subjects that matter and apply to evidence custodians of all varieties. We're going to begin our discussion with a show that we're calling Between Now and Normal: How to Safely Reopen at the End of a Pandemic. And I think that there are a lot of skills, even if you're already open, there might be some things that you could pick up, but we'll give some guidance and some basic information. And our goal is we're going to stretch this out. There will be fewer episodes as we are able to return back to work and get out in the country and as I do my job on a more regular basis. But we're going to take deeper dives and we're going to try to get people who are experts in the field. I'd love to have James come back and just do one complete webinar, one complete topic on fentanyl exposure and opioid exposure because the man knows what he's talking about. He has experienced it firsthand, not being exposed, but they've had exposures at that agency that they've learned from, and I think that that'll be another great topic to have. And we've got so many things in the works for this show that I'm excited about that we don't have quite solidified yet, so I can't really put it in stone. But I think that every webinar session that we do with the evidence show is going to teach you something new, and it's going to have information that you can apply directly to what you do in your operation. So catch us on June 11th. Do nothing if you've signed up. If you're here, there's no further purchase required. Just show up on June 11th at 2 p.m. Central or whatever time it is where you are. So, our agenda today is we're going to talk about training issues. We're going to talk about biological evidence. We're going to talk about non evidentiary property. And for most of us, non evidentiary property is the bane of our existence. But we're going to talk about it anyways because it's a real part of what we do. And I don't know too many agencies that can avoid dealing with non evidentiary property. I'll show you how to take the exam. I'll show you where to go to take the exam. And again, at the end, when we finish, we'll wrap up this portion in an hour. The last 30 minutes or however long there are questions, we'll stay online and answer your questions specifically related to the content that is covered today, or maybe questions about the exam process. I'll help walk you through that, but I try to hold to that 1 hour content window. Again, the notes, if you're joining us late, are available in the webinar window uh, on your screen. They're also available on the Facebook Community Evidence Management Forum. Uh, you can find those there as well. We will also post them on our website as soon as training is over, and we'll also post links to the exam, which we'll talk about at the end of class. So you can find those. They will be ubiquitous everywhere soon. Now, James is not here, but I put his picture up anyways because I'd hoped he'd be here, but he's got to work. And it's been a crazy week. So that is a much younger version of me. I don't know why I chose Robin instead of Batman. I think because he got to wear shorts, and shorts are cool. But I'm Sean, and I'll be talking to you today about training. Training is incredibly important. I don't say that because I train professionally for a living, because I retired from law enforcement to do training and consulting. I say that because I believe it. And it's not just the training that I provide or people like James provide. Um, Training is critical to the success of your operation. And I guess I could have just. So we're going to talk about training, specifically what the types of training that are critical for evidence management and evidence custodians, what you need to help you be successful, uh, because this is not a natural issue for anybody. We're not born with knowledge about evidence management. It has to come through training, and that training has certain variables that will. There are certain variables about training that will make you more successful as an agency, and we'll discuss those today. When it comes to your whole organization, there are two types of evidence management training that are critical to your success as an agency. The first is specific evidence management unit training. Classes like this, or classes that are specific to your agency, how you train your employees inside the evidence management unit to do their jobs, is incredibly important. But there is also the wider component of agency wide evidence management training. And I think that this is one area where most agencies could make huge strides in their training program that would help their evidence unit tremendously just by making a few small tweaks to their agency wide evidence management training program. When we talk about evidence management training programs, especially for agencies, like how do your officers learn to package evidence? How do they learn to submit evidence? Now, there are two different models. And what I would like to propose at the onset, before we talk about anything else about training, is one of the the deadly sins in law enforcement is the way it used to be, or that's the way we've always done it. Anytime the answer to a question is that's the way we've always done it, question that. And in most agencies, or at least agencies that I've been exposed to, the way officers have learned to package evidence, the way that they have learned to submit evidence or document evidence, has typically come through the FTO program or the PTO program. And generally, I was an FTO and a PTO, a police training officer, when I was a young uh, police officer. And I can tell you, when I was a field training officer, when I was a police training officer, I would train my recruits how to submit evidence. But I want to tell you a secret. At that time, I had never worked in the evidence unit. I had never been on the other side of the lockers. I didn't know anything about evidence management whatsoever. And I was the guy that was training these young recruits how to submit evidence. The results of that, you can pretty much you can figure out on your own. We had a history and a culture at the agency I was employed at where officers really didn't know how to submit evidence or package evidence. And what we found here at the Evidence Management Institute is that agencies that have the FTO training model for officers learning how to package, and submit evidence, Typically, the results are not uh, they're not consistent, and they're not what they ought to be or not what they would be, because you're training officers with training officers who don't know anything about what they're training, and that's bad. We recommend that evidence management personnel are involved with the training process, especially training young officers. I know that when I was in charge of our evidence unit, I would just we had a box of rocks in our agency, and that box of rocks was there as a constant reminder. It made me angry every time I saw it. And I would take that box of rocks, and we would take our recruits through the unit, and I would show them the box of rocks, and I would let them know this can never be you, because if it is, you and I are going to have problems. And young officers are impressionable. When you threaten them early in their careers, they learn not to do stupid things like submit rocks with no probative forensic value. Uh, so that the time to teach them is early on, the time to catch them is early on, and the best way to do that is to train them in the practices that they're going to use in the field, and to continue to provide training to them as they grow. I also want to talk about a concept here that is critical that we start to kind of embrace throughout law enforcement, and that's the concept of training people to competency. Having someone sit through a course, having them sit through a PowerPoint presentation is not necessarily going to guarantee or ensure success. When we train to competency, it's a slightly different model. It's a standard that basically combines a set of competency criteria with an observation of their ability to complete that task. So, to contrast, instead of just giving people a PowerPoint presentation about evidence packaging or just providing a packaging manual, you have a training class. And part of training to competency is that they learn the steps required to package property, and they demonstrate their ability to package evidence or property, and that's observed. When you've observed that happen in training, you can expect that to happen in the field. And that is a great way to start expectations. That's why we recommend all evidence training, whether it's internal evidence management unit training or agency wide training, that there be some measure of training to competency to where we can begin to establish that performance expectation in our officers and make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. Um, so the evidence personnel training program, this is for people that are inside the evidence unit, people that are working in evidence operations on a daily basis, or that's a primary responsibility. They should receive documented job training that covers each area of responsibility when it relates to duties or jobs or tasks that they're supposed to complete as evidence managers. If we don't train our employees how to take in evidence the way our agency takes in evidence, or how to dispose of evidence appropriately, then we're exposing ourselves to a huge liability with respect to training, but we're also doing our employees a disservice by not equipping them appropriately to do their jobs. So, evidence personnel should receive training in those specific job areas, uh, just as a baseline for doing their jobs. And that extends to uh, temporary employees. I'm not a huge fan of temporary assignments to the evidence unit. I've found just anecdotally that they can do a lot of damage in a very short amount of time if they're not appropriately trained and supervised. It's a great force multiplier if you train them and you document that training. But any person who works inside your evidence vault needs to receive documented training. That is an absolute baseline standard for evidence management, that if you allow people to work in your operation, that you train them on exactly what they're supposed to do, and that they're supervised appropriately. So we recommend, as a minimum baseline, there are certain things that we would expect all evidence custodians, all evidence managers to be trained on. And one of those things is safety, and just safety equipment. It is critical that evidence custodians, especially in view of COVID or other coronavirus transmissions or fentanyl exposures, we have to show people how to use personal protective gear. Officers receive training on personal or on PPG or personal protective gear, uh, with respect to, maybe riot masks or things that they're going to use in the field. But we need to teach our evidence managers how to use the stuff and how to apply the stuff so that it's going to protect them from exposure when they're exposed to something, and teach them the appropriate times and uses and places for personal protective gear. That protects the employee from unintentional or accidental exposure, protects the agency from liability, because there is a right way and a wrong way to put on gloves. There is a right way and a wrong way and a right time to wear an N95 respirator mask. We need to train our employees on those times and those occasions and how and when to do it. And that also extends to every piece of equipment that you've got in your operation. If you've got a scissor lift that helps you get up to the tall shelves or an extremely tall ladder, you need to do documented safety training that shows that people have been taught the safe way to use equipment for each type of safety equipment in the unit. And that extends to eye wash stations. I was in an evidence room not too long ago, and I pointed out, I said, do you know how to use that? It was an eye wash station. They didn't even know what it was. So if you've got an eye wash station and no one knows that it's an eye wash station, if you've got an exposure, no one is going to be able to use it. And that's unconscionable. We have to teach people the right way, the safe way to conduct their business in the room, and show them the safety equipment that they have available to them. All training should be accompanied by update training whenever policies or procedures change. That's a baseline function. And we also recommend that all evidence managers, and we've talked about this a little bit when we talked about firearms, but it is critical that evidence custodians, especially civilians who don't typically handle firearms in the normal course of their duties, to provide documented safety training specific to firearms, to show them how to handle firearms safely, to show them how to identify the make, model, serial number, finish, and all the unique identifiers related to firearms, and how to confirm that that firearm has been made safe, how to visually confirm that that firearm has been made safe. Those are three things that we often forget or neglect to train evidence custodians on, especially in a law enforcement agency where you've got sworn personnel making decisions. You don't think about the fact that maybe our civilians haven't had the same degree of exposure or experience to firearms and might not have the same level of comfort in dealing with them. Those three things are incredibly important. Make a few more plugs for training here today. One is just your involvement in a professional association. Um, I can't underscore, and I think I've mentioned this in every class. Okay, that that if you're not involved in a professional association in your state, get involved. If you don't have one in your state, start one. Uh, Professional associations like CAPE in California, like TAPE It in Texas, like NIPIT in New Mexico. Still can't pronounce that one right. Uh, they are important for evidence custodians. MAPE in Missouri is just starting out this year. They've just formed. So, Missouri, I mean, if you're in any state with an association, that's going to be the best place to maintain current with laws and trends and technology and things that come out related to evidence custodians in your area. There is no better networking opportunity or problem solving opportunity than being involved in a state association. And not only that, when you organize, I mean, in evidence management, sometimes we have the sense that we are underrepresented or that we are ignored by our agencies. And that may be true, uh, but that shouldn't become our reality. We shouldn't let that define us. By participating in a professional association at the state level, that can help drive change in your state and give you a voice that maybe you didn't have before. Maybe you don't have at your agency, but by participating in a state association, um, that voice can become magnified. And we would love to help. If you're in a state that doesn't have an association, please contact me directly. We would love to connect people. Minnesota right now is in the process of reforming or starting a new association. So, they're and Washington State. I've got information. I still haven't put their information up, but there are basically 13 states with some type of formal or informal evidence association in the country. That means if you do the math, which I haven't, and I'm not going to do right here, I have a feeling, that means 37 states don't have representation. That there are 37 states in the union that don't have an evidence association where people can go to other evidence custodians and find information. Last little plug I'll make about training is someday we're going to start training again and we're going to start doing it live. We don't know, quite honestly, when police agencies are going to allow their employees to attend training. We don't know when those opportunities are going to arise, but we will definitely be back out on the road. If you're interested in hosting a class or having us come to you, please let me know. Just reach out. I would love to do a class in your jurisdiction or in your area. So just let me know, but keep us in mind for future training uh, because that's really one of our wheelhouse items. So I'm going to look at the question list and see if there are any training questions that have popped up. Peef in Florida. Did I not list Florida? Yeah, okay. I didn't list Peef, but yeah, that's another great association. And Peef in Florida, Cape in California, those are probably two of the more active and engaging associations out there and most progressive. So, so another question on where's the test? That'll be at the end. So we didn't have any training questions. Good. So we'll move on to biological evidence. The one thing I'd like, and when we're talking about biological evidence, I'll stop down and I'll just define it. When I talk about biological evidence, it's a kind of an elusive definition. So we're gonna use the definition of evidence items that contain or may contain or are believed to contain biological source material. Now, that can be blood, hair, tissue, or other trace evidence. But if you believe that it contains or it's submitted because it contains biological source material, that's what we're going to use as our definition for biological evidence. In the state of Texas, they define biological evidence as anything that may contain biological evidence, which was a terrible definition. And our legislators just weren't that good at writing laws because anything may contain. So we like to constrict that definition down a little bit to things known or believed to contain biological source material. When I talk about sane kits, just for uh, the sake of all being on the same page and understanding, I know that these are called different things in different states. In our state, we call sane kits a sexual assault nurse examiner kit. It's a sane kit. When I refer to that, is sexual assault evidence that's collected by a nurse practitioner or a nurse in a hospital setting and then delivered to law enforcement to help with sexual assault investigations. So, when it comes to biological evidence, and I hope that this is not too reductive, I hope that this is not skirting the issue too much. But I really believe that there is a great set of standards out there that provides incredible guidance on biological evidence. It's already been written and it's been universally agreed upon by evidence managers, by lab entities, by forensic scientists, by law enforcement. NIST is a standardizing organization and they are really starting to get involved in evidence management and evidence custody issues to help kind of standardize our practices and get us on the same page across the board. In 2013, and they haven't updated it yet, but they produced and published the Evidence Preservation Handbook for evidence handlers. And there's no need to write new standards if a good standard, if a quality standard exists. And that's the practice and principle that I've taken my training from. I encourage evidence managers to use the Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook as their primary source of guidance for managing and preserving biological evidence. It is the one true universal standard or universally accepted standard that exists related to evidence management. I have a set of standards that I have written, and mine conform to the Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook because I just refer people back to the Biological Evidence Handbook. That's truly what a standard is, and I recommend it highly. The reason for that is because it provides great guidance on handling evidence and storing evidence. It will tell you based on the evidence type how to store it, what conditions to store it in. Liquid blood. Should you freeze it? Should you refrigerate it? Do you store it in temperature controlled conditions or at room temperature? It gives you the acceptable level, the acceptable storage conditions for both short term and long term storage of biological evidence. And excuse me, it is pretty inclusive. I won't read the whole list to you just because. And that all goes back to the principle of just appropriate storage for biological evidence. We want to store biological evidence under environmental conditions that are suitable for the preservation of the item. If liquid blood is not supposed to be frozen, then we don't want to put liquid blood in a freezer. You want to store the evidence according to type under the right conditions that are most likely to preserve that item and keep it viable and useful and probative as forensic evidence in a criminal proceeding. And here's another, I mean, it's the same thing. It's liquid blood. It says never store it as under frozen conditions. So that should provide us some excellent guidance on what to do with liquid blood. And I know that a lot of states are moving from the old intoxilizer machine that was cased in a big wooden thing and was full of mystery and magic. And now they're just going to all blood draws on DWIs. So we're getting a lot of blood in our evidence rooms, especially in Texas or in jurisdictions where they're doing blood DWI or blood drug or DWI investigations. Um, so we're actually getting a lot of liquid blood. We want to make sure that we're storing it in the right way uh, to keep the stuff preserved and useful. And it even provides us, in the context of this biological evidence preservation handbook, what they mean by frozen. Frozen has a very specific definition. That means 14 degrees or below. Now, your common off the shelf commercial freezer, the deep freeze that you have storing whatever you store uh, in your garage, probably doesn't freeze things down to 14 degrees. So it's important that you look at the ability of the equipment that you have to store evidence and make sure that it meets these standards. Same with refrigerators. Most commercially available refrigerators don't take the humidity level of that storage environment down below 25%. Most of them just don't do that. And they don't regulate consistently between 36 degrees Fahrenheit and 46 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the environment that you have to store biological evidence in, or most biological evidence in, if it requires refrigeration. So it's really important to look at this book and use it as the benchmark for your biological evidence practices. We have a standard with respect, or a statement with respect to sane analysis and reporting. And this is related to a nationwide trend that hopefully we are changing as a culture with respect to this issue. Are sexual assault nurse examiner kits or sexual assault evidence, things that are collected by a nurse, medical evidence that is then transferred to the police department. Um, Regardless of statutory requirements, regardless of the law in your state, our recommendation is if you collect this, that it be submitted to a lab. Most states are writing legislation that requires agencies to submit sane evidence to a forensic lab for analysis. That's but the reason we have backlogs, the reason that we have thousands and thousands of untested kits in storage across the country still is because we're still not all on the right path for that issue. Our recommendation, if you take a sane kit in, if you take forensic evidence in, it really doesn't do any good until you send it out to be analyzed. And that's just a bedrock principle uh, that we believe should be a requirement for every agency. Now, when it comes to forensically appropriate packaging of evidence, we'll talk a little bit about labeling and packaging evidence. Uh, it's important that we package it in a forensically appropriate container. For most biological evidence, that's going to be craft packaging or a cardboard box. Craft packaging, like shopping bags, uh, that is usually, I mean, almost universally a safe material for packaging most forms of biological evidence in. And if you want to know the appropriate and specific packaging options for specific types of biological evidence, you can find that direction again in the Biological Evidence Handlers Handbook by NIST. But there is a little caveat. If there is disagreement between what you find in the NIST guide and what your state lab requires you to do, follow the guidance of your state lab. They will tell you what they need. They may use different processes, different analytical tools that have different criteria or different requirements that may mitigate some of the storage issues that the NIST guide suggests. So conform to your forensic lab's requirements for packaging evidence for submission. Evidence, and I wish I had put more pictures in the presentation today, but if you submit biological evidence, if your officers submit biological evidence, there are a few things that need to be consistent and common for all biological evidence items. If it contains biological evidence, it should be clearly labeled and marked with the biohazard label, a biohazard sticker. I've got one in a drawer somewhere, but I'm not going to get up and show you because hopefully you know what that looks like. But it's incredibly important that we label this stuff when it comes in, because if you're disposing of evidence at the end of its cycle and it's not listed as biological evidence, it's not labeled with a biohazard label, and you're cutting open to the package for disposition and you find a bloody sock or a bloody glove, uh, that's just gross. And it's happened to me before. Uh, and you don't want that to happen. That wouldn't happen. We would be more careful if we knew that the item inside that package contained biological materials. So we label them because it's a safety issue. It's just important to do. So I got to move something around here. This is a dramatic pause. Okay, we'll move on. So when it comes to intake, it's really important that we provide officers or we provide investigators with an appropriate storage environment for evidence when it comes in. Um, and I'm talking about temporary secure storage for evidence. There are temporary evidence storage refrigerators available commercially that take care of this issue remarkably. They're compartmentalized to where the evidence is segregated. It's not mixed with other evidence. There's no possibility or limited or reduced possibility of cross contamination based on the compartmentalization of the storage chambers. We recommend those highly, but you don't want to submit biological evidence which has known short-term storage requirements based on the evidence type in the wrong type of environment. You want to provide your officers a temporary place to submit those things securely. The documentation of biological evidence should indicate that this is an item which may contain or is believed to contain. It's listed as biological evidence. And again, using the loose definition of biological evidence, if we believe that it has probative forensic value or we believe it contains DNA or other biological source material, we list it as biological evidence. We don't have a threshold. The shirt has to be 50% covered in human blood for it to be biological evidence. There is no threshold other than we believe that this contains biological matter, biological material for a criminal investigation. We recommend that, especially with SANE kits or SART kits or whatever you call them in your jurisdiction, it's really critical that we require the people that collect that evidence and provide it to law enforcement that they are very diligent about their chain of custody documentation with respect to those items. Chain of custody doesn't come naturally. At least to the same level and same requirements for law enforcement. Obviously, there are chain of custody processes in medicine, but a lot of times they're not thinking about that when they're filling out the kits. It's incredibly important that they document appropriately and that we provide documentation for them and training if they don't have it in order to preserve the chain of custody and make sure that we know that we can track the chain of custody of that item after it's submitted by the nurse examiner. With respect to disposition of biological evidence, this is an area where, I mean, if I get a, that's kind of gross. If I get a bloody nose, Like if my nose just started bleeding right here, I would use a Kleenex and I would throw it in the trash. That technically is biological evidence. But we don't just throw biological evidence in the trash because I mean, we don't do that because it's not the right thing to do with biological evidence. I mean, just forensically. We don't get to make the distinction or the determination that this just has a teeny bit of biological evidence in it. We're going to throw it in the trash. We recommend that that your practices conform to state law, but we recommend just incineration for almost all forms of biological evidence. There are firms out there that will provide remote incineration or that you can actually mail the packages to them for incineration um, if you can't find a facility near you. Another option that may be open or available to you, especially if you've got a good relationship with the hospitals in your area, is you may be able to piggyback on their practices or their services, and they might be able to help you uh, provide safe and secure incineration for environmentally appropriate incineration or disposition of those biological materials. That's just an option that may be available to you. Fire department might also have a contract with a hazmat company that takes care of hazardous materials disposition. There's no need for an agency or an entity or a municipality to pay twice for the same type of service. I would recommend checking out, seeing what the fire department does, and also contact the hospital and see if you can work with them as well. So let me check and see if there are any biological evidence questions. And I got a couple. If you got questions about training, uh, if you'd reach out to me offline, or I can answer those afterwards. And let me see if I can turn the microphone up a little bit. That's as high as it goes. Here's a question: do you also mark biological evidence for possible diseases like HIV or hepatitis, etc.? I think if that's a known issue, a known quantity, that there might be some value there. But if we know that an item is biological evidence, I think the safest practice is to presume pathogens and contamination with pathogens like HIV, like HEP, like coronavirus. If we make the presumption that those items are contaminated with pathogens, at least bacteria, uh, then there's not a necessary requirement to go find out what is exactly that biological evidence is contaminated with. That's why we encourage and require employees to use appropriate PPG when they're handling and disposing of evidence. You never want to be disposing of evidence without an N95 mask and appropriate nitrile gloves that are, you know, up to the standards of the NFPA, the National Fire Prevention, or I think it's Prevention Association. They've established standards for nitrile gloves. You want to be wearing quality nitrile gloves and an N95 mask anytime you're getting into evidence packages, because the possibility exists for exposure or contamination in any circumstance. And that's why we wear this stuff all the time when we're dealing with those things, especially if we're unsealing packages. So we're going to talk about non-evidentiary property, the bane of probably most of your existence. And obviously, we're not going to have time in 20 minutes to cover the issue the way we would be able to cover it in a 2 day class. But if you have continuing questions or issues, we can even reach back out in one of our deeper dives and talk about non-evidentiary property or specific types of non-evidentiary property. In a later webinar or podcast, we're going to hit the high points today. Fun thing about non-evidentiary property is that it's really truly different from every jurisdiction and every state. We're going to talk about some general things that can be applied to non-evidentiary property consistently, but every state does things differently. There are states that have no guidance in their laws whatsoever about non-evidentiary property. And then there are states that have state laws that are so restrictive that it requires us to do things that are just absolutely ridiculous with non-evidentiary property, Texas being one. Uh, and then we'll get into that. But it's a fun topic to discuss, and I think universally none of us got into this. It's hard to have a passion for non-evidentiary property. With criminal evidence, we maintain that stuff because people's lives are at stake. Generally with a backpack from a third grader that's been dropped on the school bus and somehow made it back to you and your police department because some other kid threw it out the back. Uh, that's not something most of us are typically too passionate about, but it does belong to someone. It's important to someone. So it's important that we take care of it appropriately and according to the law. We divide non-evidentiary property into found property, safekeeping property, and abandoned property. And we use those three distinctions and those three definitions because it kind of gives us guidance on what to do with each type of non-evidentiary property. Found property, just quickly defined, it's something that somebody picked up somewhere that has an unknown owner and that we believe still has an owner that still may want that property. Now that is a cliff noted butchered version of found property, but it's basically exactly what you say it is. It's found property. Somebody found it. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to somebody. It's property that indicates unintentional loss by the rightful owner. Now that's a little bit different than safekeeping property. Safekeeping property is any item that's submitted to the evidence management unit. It's not evidence, it's not potential evidence, and it belongs to a known owner. Generally, safekeeping items are submitted on behalf of a known owner so that that can be returned to that owner at a future date and time. So that's a critical distinction between found property and safekeeping property is we know who this belongs to. We have to give it back to them. Now, abandoned property is a little bit different animal. Abandoned property can really fit three different forms, and abandonment is never clearly distinguished in at least in most of the laws that I've read. But the important thing about abandoned property is that it's submitted to the evidence management unit. It's not designated as evidence in a criminal case or civil proceeding. And one of three things have occurred. Either it's been clearly abandoned prior to submission, like a house that has been abandoned. I mean, there might be a bag of drugs that was left behind in the house. The house was vacant. You find the stuff, it's abandoned. That might be one version of abandoned property. Another type of abandonment happens in the evidence unit itself. So after storage and appropriate notifications have been made by the evidence unit, the owner fails to come pick up the property within the specified or required amount of time, we consider that type of property to be abandoned as well. Now, the really tricky definition is in our definition is any aggregate of circumstances that suggests abandonment by the owner. And this really is kind of the catch-all. I think we mentioned last week, we talked about a specific, after an inventory, you've got these property items that aren't labeled, but they're in your evidence room. They existed somewhere, sometime, they were associated with something, but now it's just a pile of stuff. Uh, that type of property, we would also, by the circumstances surrounding it, we would consider those abandoned as well. So the thing about non-evidentiary property that's important to think about is that non-evidentiary property involves constitutional rights. Most non-evidentiary property belongs to someone. There is a property right, a constitutional right to that item for the owner. And it's really critical that we keep that in mind when we deal with non-evidentiary property, because we're really ensuring the rights, the basic civil rights of our citizens are met when we appropriately take care of non-evidentiary property. So it's generally not evidence. I mean, it's not generally, it's by definition, it's not evidence. But one important principle to discuss is that we treat non-evidentiary property with the same level of security, the same chain of custody, the same management and operations as stored evidence. Now, there are a few distinctions, but it's really critical that we don't just let non-evidentiary property have a much lower standard than evidence, because those things creep in and they cross polarize, and that causes problems. So we believe, or we teach, that non-evidentiary property should be stored separately from evidence. There is never a compelling business or forensic reason to store non-evidentiary property with evidentiary property. The possibility of cross-contamination is increased, so let's just keep the stuff separate. But a really compelling business reason to store it is typically non-evidentiary property is property that we're going to be able to get rid of much more rapidly than we are evidence. The life cycle of non-evidentiary property is much shorter than evidentiary property. So that's a part of our agency, that's a part of our storage system that we want to be accessing and circulating regularly. A lot of states have state laws with respect to not evidentiary property. Most of those require or specify notification processes, notification timeframes, value ladders for dealing with certain types of property. In Texas, we have to send a certified letter to the owner of the property before we can technically do much with it, depending on the kind of property that we're dealing with. Well, certified letters are extremely expensive. Our laws also require us to publish in a paper of record. Well, no one reads newspapers anymore. Who knows what the paper of record is for your particular jurisdiction? And that process is expensive. So in Texas, we've got these antiquated laws based on technologies that aren't used anymore. Your state may be similar. These are things that we need to change throughout the evidence management industry throughout the country. Is to change the notification mediums. Let's move it from newspapers to the city website, things like that. But if it's established in law, then you have to change the law before you can change the practice. But those state laws are going to govern those types of transactions for you, and often not necessarily the way you would want. We require packaging and submission protocols to be equivalent. We expect that people are going to package not evidentiary property the same way that they're going to package evidentiary property. And I know that a lot of police officers, a lot of submitting officers will balk at that. But when you take in a purse and you allow the officer just to write purse with stuff in it, purse with various or miscellaneous things inside, that non-evidentiary property, if they haven't itemized it, if they haven't inventoried it, probably contains some stuff that could have been used as evidence as well. I can't tell you how many times I have taken in non-evidentiary property before we required different descriptions and different inventories and different standards, but you would find drugs inside of a purse or a wallet or a stolen credit card inside of one of these containers. So a lot of times if we don't require officers to submit this the same way they would evidence, then we're gonna take in things that we don't know what they are, and that's never good. Some best practices related to property evidence: field releases. If an officer finds a wallet in the field and finds the driver's license inside, there's no cash or there's $5 left. Um, is that something that you take back to the station, book into property evidence, and then require the evidence custodian to release and contact? Uh, that's a great argument and a great question. If you allow or enable field releases of non-evidentiary property, we recommend that you have a documented procedure that is documented before you do that type of process. And the reason for that is because if you don't protect your employees with a documented process for releasing non-evidentiary property in the field, it's going to come back and it can haunt you. When you, out of the goodwill of your heart, take that wallet to the owner and bring it to him, and he says, "Thank you." And then 5 days later, he said, "Well, the officer stole $500 from my wallet." It is very difficult if there's been no documentation of that ever happening. It is very difficult to go back and substantiate or declare or determine that there wasn't $500 in there. So if you document it and provide a receipt at the time uh, of the transaction that the individual signs for, um, that can cut down on those types of incidents from occurring. Got here a note for the return priority of non-evidentiary property. I mean, non-evidentiary property can build up quickly in your agency and overtake you if you are not diligent about getting rid of it. So for our unit and for what I recommend for other units is that you make non-evidentiary property, that found property, you make that a priority because that's stuff that you can get out of your shop rapidly, sometimes within 30 days. Um, Sometimes a little bit longer, but certainly not nearly as long as the cycle that you're going to have for the rest of evidence in your custody. Just a couple of items about safekeeping. If you're going to take things in for safekeeping purposes, it is important that you as an agency require the officer to identify the owner for whom you are keeping that item safe for. That needs to happen prior to submission. I can't tell you how many times I've heard of officers submitting evidence for safekeeping, but we haven't documented or haven't identified the owner of that property. Well, it's not really safekeeping if we don't know who it belongs to. Even stuff that comes in stolen with no known owner, um, at the beginning, that's evidence. But when we determine who the owner is, we can change the classification of that item. So we believe that it is the officer's responsibility to provide notified or to provide notification to the person at the time. Like if an officer takes something for safekeeping, he should notify that person of the procedures for retrieving that item at the time. That's just a best practice. That way we don't have due process issues or concerns when we provide them a receipt and we provide them steps on how to get their property back. Found property, kind of the same thing. The one thing I would like to say about found property, unless you exist in a state like California, California has a very specific law related to finders keepers. But our agency, we would return items to the finder. If someone finds $100, they would turn it in as found property. We would give them a little pink form, and that pink form would say, "Hey, if no one claims it within 30 days, you can have this $100." And I started researching that practice, and I started looking into the law. And what I found was that there was no legal authority to give that item to anybody other than the owner. So we had this practice that didn't conform to any law. We didn't really have a policy related to it. We just had a pink sheet that we would hand people. So we had to change our procedures and our practices to meet our authorization level or our authority level under the law. If you can't do something based on the law, if you don't have the legal authority to do something, it's one of those things that you should probably think about not doing. There are states that allow that, and if you're protected by law or by policy that your chief signs off on, that might be another issue. But you don't just want to have a practice of doing that without being covered by a policy or a procedure. With respect to abandoned property, the last thing we'll talk about here is abandoned property. And the thing I want to talk about abandoned property is abandoned property, basically property that's abandoned by you. Uh, Items that you can't determine what case they belong to. The labels have fallen off. Um, they were after an inventory. This is just stuff that just exists and nobody knows the history of it. None of that stuff is ever going to have any evidentiary value whatsoever because it has no chain of custody. If you don't know what case it belonged to, then you can't attest to anything about the chain of custody for that item. So the best thing to do in most cases is consider it abandoned property. But you want your chief to sign off in a memorandum. When you've got a list, I would even encourage you, if you've got an evidence management system, enter those items in as abandoned and then write a memo to the chief and then dispose of those. There is no reason to keep, 50-year old collection of jack stands or bottle jacks or empty beer bottles or other abandoned items that have just been found, stereo parts. Uh, there's no reason to keep those in perpetuity just because the label has fallen off. Now, that does mean that we want to put labels on items that don't fall off because we really shouldn't have these problems to begin with. If we've got appropriate packaging, we won't have those types of things happen. But I could virtually guarantee that most of us work in an agency that if you've been around for even 25, 50 years, you might have items that meet that category. That's one way to deal with it. So all of this, each of the 7 sessions that we've done has been kind of a shotgun evidence management, a crash course in evidence management. We've tried to distill as much as we could out of a 2-day class into 7 hours. And there is still a lot to cover. There's still a lot to learn. But we are at the end of our exam today. So I wanted to explain to you the process or how to take the completion exam and print a certificate that just shows that you've spent 8 hours training on this. Now, to answer a couple of questions just at the onset, Is this state certified? No, it's not state certified. I mean, I don't, let me get back to that. There we go. Uh, Typically when we work with a jurisdiction, we can provide the lesson plan to the state certifying organization. We haven't done that with this class because we're in 50 different states. We're in several different countries. Uh, so there is no state level or state credit for taking this. This is just good baseline knowledge for you as an evidence custodian that we hope is useful to you. But we did want to provide a completion exam just to document the fact that you've spent the time to learn a little bit more about your profession and that you've learned something in the class. That's going to be helpful for you and it's going to be helpful for us. We've done a completion exam and you can take that and I will provide, I actually put that in the chat window now. Um, let's see. This is live and in person. So if you can see the chat window, I'm going to type this little message in there and send it to everybody. Hopefully you can get that from the link in the window. If not, I'll read it out to you. I will also post it on our website as soon as I'm finished with the training class. But that link is HTTPS. It is a secure site. And then I don't know my punctuation marks anymore, but the two dots and then the slashes and then the s.evidencemanagement.com/EMI online. That's the URL for the exam. There is a link at the bottom of your page because what I've just explained to you is probably confusing. I will also put a link on our client resources page at evidencemanagement.com. I'm not going to put this on the community forum because we don't have, I mean, everyone that's on the forum hasn't necessarily taken this class. And this exam is limited to people that have sat through the class. There is a certifying question on there that just says, yeah, I sat through the class. A little more formally, but it's a 30-question multiple choice test. It comes from the class work. It comes from the stuff that we've discussed specifically in this class. And if you pass it with an 80% or more, it will print a little certificate that you can download that just certifies this is how I've spent 8 hours of my time here during the pandemic learning about stuff. So again, the URL is in the webinar panel there. It's printed on that screen, which you can't copy and paste from there, but I will also post it on our website under our client resource page at evidencemanagement.com. Now that brings us to 258. The last thing I would want to say is, the last two things I want to say. I want to encourage you to come back on June 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Stat. That the time might be wrong because I'm really having difficulty with Eastern time and Central time. But the same time that you showed up today, next week, we're going to start the evidence show. The first episode is going to be between now and normal, talking about reopening safely at the end of a pandemic. We are going to start deep dives every couple of weeks on evidence topics that I would hope that you would tune in for. I would like to thank you for your participation. Thank you for being here. It is encouraging to me to see people that, despite maybe sheltering in place or maybe not in a normal operational environment, still taking the time out of their day to learn more about their profession and learn something new. Hopefully, you've learned something new through this training class. If not, hopefully it's reinforced some concepts that you already knew that you're going to carry forward and do in perpetuity in the future. I mean, really, the person that I'd hope we would reach with this class is someone who worked at an agency that is remote, that can't get to training, or their agency can't necessarily afford to send them to training. And now with this pandemic, there's no way they would ever get to training. So providing this training for me and for this organization, and I know I speak for James as well, has been a joy. It's been something that has given us something valuable to do with our time, and hopefully it's given you a valuable way to spend your time as well. So if there are questions, this is the end of the discussion. And that is right at 3 o'clock. I couldn't have planned that any better. I'm going to look at the screen and see if there are questions from you. If not, we will end this. Um, but thanks for being here, and I look forward to seeing you on June 11th for the first edition or first-ish, I guess, episode of the Evidence Show. We'll have a new page set up on our website, but if you've already signed up for this, if you're here today, you're signed up for that. So just show up, same bat time, same bat channel, and check out that community Facebook forum. So I'm going to check the screen here as people drop off. Okay, here's one question, and this is about sexual assault kits. How long do we keep these kits after disposition? Well, I would say never after disposition. Uh, we don't want to keep these kits after when you dispose of something, it should be gone. But I think the question might be, how long do we keep these up until we dispose of it? That really depends on state law now. Um, when you think about the offenses that are typically tied to sane kits, they're almost always felony offenses. They're almost always capers crimes, crimes against persons. So because of that it's usually tied to a felony. There are going to be state laws that require us to keep this evidence for a certain period of time. I would follow your state guidance on those laws. I know in Texas, biological evidence that is related to a felony case is kept a minimum of 40 years. So in Texas, we've got laws that govern that. Almost every state in the union has biological evidence retention law that's hopefully going to be something similar to that. So sane kits are things that we're not going to be able to dispose of for quite some time. Here's a question: How do I get my officers to take? Ah, they've been submitting biohazard items without biohazard labels. Um, I think the best thing to do is open the package, sprinkle it on their lunch, uh, because I mean, it's a teachable moment, and I wouldn't do that, but I would make sure that you help them understand the importance of those biohazard labels. Speak to them directly, and after that, that's to me an unlabeled biohazard package or any kind of hazardous hazmat material that's unlabeled that comes to you without a label. To me, that's a pretty egregious offense. That's something that I would have a personal conversation with them. If that doesn't work, then I would have things go up the chain. But in order to have those effective conversations, you got to have a relationship one. So that's kind of another topic entirely. But you also have to have policies in place that allow you to hold officers accountable for improper submission of evidence. So you have to have procedures in place and requirements to use those stickers and labels written down so that you can have the expectation that they can be held accountable for doing that. I would be happy to discuss that with you more offline. If you've got further questions, just give me a call or send me an email. But that is a very common problem that people have. Now, here's a great question, and this is going to seem like a total uh, a total punt on this. But should a sane kit be refrigerated after it returns from the lab? Now, here is the one true statement, the one useful statement that I could make about sane kits and storage after the lab. The one thing that I can say definitively is follow your lab's guidance on storage of sane kits post analysis. And the reason for that is kind of threefold. One, sane kits aren't consistent throughout the country. I mean, there isn't a sane kit, a national standard for sane kits, and for the type of specimens and type of things that they collect. It's different from agency to agency or from state to state. So it's going to contain different biological materials, which are going to require different biological storage methods, or it has the possibility of that. Your state lab or the lab that you use, most of us probably use a state lab for those, unless you've got a local lab at your local agency, or if you're a federal agency, you've got another lab. But we have some stakeholder partner lab that we work with. Um, get specific written documentation from the lab on storage of sane kits post analysis. Pre-analysis, we know that we generally keep them refrigerated until they're submitted to the lab. Post-analysis, when they come back, um, they might not be subject to the same refrigeration requirements, but get that in writing from your lab, because that will give you specific guidance on what to do with the same kits that you're storing at your agency. What about needles? don't store them. Those are other things to sprinkle in their lunches. Uh, there's usually no probative forensic value in a needle. Now, if you've got an officer that wants to charge some guy with heroin possession because there's a squazillionth of heroin in the tip of that needle, I mean, I, generally needles should go in sharps containers and be disposed of. Now, there are always exceptions to that rule, uh, but generally, needles shouldn't be submitted as evidence unless it's just they're absolutely probative or valuable as forensic evidence. But if you've got somebody that's, I mean, for possession, like a paraphernalia charge or some minor offense, I would prohibit most needles from coming in except under very specific circumstances. That stuff needs to go in a sharps container and needs to be disposed of appropriately in a sharps container. Here's a great question. What is the best practice for searching for inventorying a backpack taken in as safekeeping? And here is what I would recommend as a best practice for backpacks. In our agency and in other agencies, other people that I've talked to, officers love to submit a backpack with all the crap inside it and just label it backpack. And maybe if you're lucky, red backpack. Well, as an agency, as an evidence unit, you need to have specific procedures written in place for inventorying and submitting items like backpacks, like purses, like briefcases, any container that contains a bunch of other stuff. You need to have a policy and a procedure in your packaging manual on how to inventory and how to document backpacks. My recommendation is, as a best practice, that if an officer is going to submit a backpack, then he needs to, I mean, depending on the types of items that are inside, he needs to identify and inventory the contents of that backpack. Now, if it's full of school papers, those things can be aggregated and maybe stored together and stored in the backpack. But if you've got anything other than items that can be linked to the same owner, uh, but if there's currency, if there's drugs, if there are weapons, if there are credit cards, if there's identifying information, if there's anything that doesn't belong to the owner, if there are any type of electronics, anything of value, that stuff needs to be pulled out and individually submitted as a piece of property. Um, at the very least, it should be inventoried in that item. But I recommend pulling these items out and requiring officers to inventory them specifically because you, as the evidence custodian, you're responsible for all of the stuff in that backpack. If an officer is allowed to just submit a backpack with stuff, and that's the definition, you're probably going to find a gun in one of those backpacks or an 8 ball of heroin. I mean, you're going to find stuff that's not just stuff, it's criminal stuff that you can't return back to them. You're going to find stolen credit cards. I mean, that has to be part of the culture, and that's one of the things that needs to change in most agencies with respect to their culture is how do we submit these things appropriately. I mean, we have to identify you're responsible for what is inside that backpack. The officer is responsible for it as well. Again, if that doesn't kind of help provide a little bit of guidance, please contact me directly. I'd be happy to answer any of these. Here's a question about humidity and labels falling off. Absolutely. I mean, we shouldn't have higher than 60% humidity in our evidence vault to begin with. Because if we've got higher levels of humidity, then we're not storing our evidence in a temperature controlled environment. That we know to begin with. But the type of labels that you use on your packages are incredibly important. And if you use an adhesive on your labels, and this is probably too much into the weeds, but there are permanent adhesives that will adhere to the surface of the item that the label is applied to and will also adhere to the label substrate or the label surface permanently. And they will do that in high heat conditions. They will do it in high humidity conditions. I mean, there are evidence labels. There are labels that will last on oil field pipe in production for 5, 10, 15 years that are the same type of materials. That's why we recommend polypropylene labels printed with a thermal transfer printer, using wax resin ribbons, and using a permanent adhesive, because that stuff will actually stay on the package regardless of the humidity levels. Now, if you've got outdoor storage, if you've got bikes in storage that are outdoors, or you've got stuff that's stored in under cold storage conditions, and then you need the same label needs to last and be durable and permanent in each of those conditions. So regardless of the humidity level, you should have the expectation that your labels are going to stay on the package. If your labels don't stay on your packages, then you're using the wrong type of label or the wrong type of adhesive. So that's why it's important. And I mean, I learned this the hard way. I learned this the same way we learned right here. I mean, I had labels falling off of packages that I just applied, and it was because of humid conditions or because the package was in irregular shape. We have to have labels that are better than that. So, how soon do we have to take the test? I'm not going to take the test off the website. I mean, anytime soon. So, if you're watching this, who knows how long from now, there might be a point at which it does. But you know, the intent or goal for this class was to have it available as a resource to evidence managers, that's just available, just open, that's just free, because we feel that strongly that this stuff needs to be available to evidence custodians. Regardless of whether you're able to attend training or not, there needs to be some kind of training out there available to you that's useful. So because of that, we're going to leave it on our website. We're going to leave it up. uh, so as long as you can find it on our website, that test will still be available. The link will still be available. Will still be something that you can take. So that's the short answer there. And a couple thank yous. You're absolutely very welcome. Um, this has been fun for me, and I appreciate y'all being here. Oh, this is important. And James was working today; he couldn't be on. But James, if you could tell us, we had someone tune in just specifically for an update on the ducks, and I think it would be unconscionable for us not to provide that type of information. So if you're not working, James, if you're still on the line, if you haven't had to jump off, please let us know, or post something on the Facebook Evidence Management Community Forum that gives us information about the ducks. Um, so let's see, make sure I'm not missing any questions. And if you said thank you, you are absolutely very welcome. And here's a question: if you don't pass the test the first time, can you take it again? Absolutely. You can retake it again. I mean, my goal here is not to fail people for a class that you've taken for free. It's just to ensure that you've learned something. So yeah, you can take the class over if you fail it. I don't think people are going to fail it. It's not too terribly tricky. But if you have issues, if you have questions, if there are questions that you find are problematic or stupid, or you think are just flat wrong, let me know. I can't guarantee 100% accuracy and validity of the test, so I'm open to uh, checking it. Here's a good question: if sane kits have been previously stored in general storage unrefrigerated, should I move them to refrigerated storage? Again, this might seem like a punt, but contact the lab, ask them this question, and get it in writing. Even if it's just in an email, ask them that question, because I don't know what the contents of your stain kit are. More than likely, there's typically swabs. There might be urine. Sometimes there's blood. So there are different evidence types inside those packages. Contact your lab and ask them. Generally, what I have found in most cases is if the lab returns it to you and it's not refrigerated, then and you store it in a temperature controlled environment, typically that's appropriate. I mean, if that's the way the lab is stored at post analysis, that's probably the way they would expect you to store it post analysis, and that's probably appropriate. But definitely contact them and get that information from them in writing, from the lab manager, or if there is something published by the lab on those processes or procedures, get that information from them. Absolutely. And can I take the exam anytime? Yes, you can start taking the exam now if you can follow that little tiny link there at the bottom of your page. Can you take it more than once? If you don't pass the first time, um, absolutely you can take it again. But my request would be, because there is a cost associated with every time that someone takes this exam, because the little computer program we use, don't take it for fun over and over and over again, because that could be problematic. And here is the reference, someone that provided Washington state law, RCW 570 dash or .010, preservation of DNA work product. Um, so that's the law in Washington, I believe. And absolutely, these kits do stack up for a long time. But the important thing is, I mean, that that we analyze these kits. The fact that they stack up, that's just a job reality for us. The unconscionable thing is for us to store evidence on a crime of this type and of this magnitude that we don't analyze, that sits in our evidence room with no ability to point to an offender. Uh, and I know that there are all kinds of circumstances and excuses and reasons people have for not submitting the stuff. I just don't find any of those compelling. If you've taken the evidence in, have it analyzed, is it going to stack up? It absolutely is. I mean, it just is. Here's a great moral dilemma question. When disposing of found property that had been stored for over a year, no owner came forward. Had one of the officers ask if they could have the item that you're disposing of. What are your thoughts about giving the item away instead of destroying them or just throwing them away? Uh, First, unquestionably, categorically, that should never, ever, 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 ever happen. Giving something of value to an officer that was submitted to the evidence unit. That just should never happen. I mean, I don't think I can state that any clearer. Now, donating it to someone else, donating it to an organization, a 501c3. I know that our agency and many other agencies would, like, when you take in bikes, you take in 200 bikes in a year, and at the end of that year, at the end of the next year, they're still there. You've never identified the owner. When we would get rid of those bikes, sometimes we would have a court, a judge issue a motion or an order that we could convert those items and donate those to a 501c3. But I would never recommend, without a legal transfer of ownership or a designation by an impartial magistrate, just giving stuff away. We don't have the authority to do that. It's not ours. It belongs to someone. An impartial magistrate needs to make that decision. And I don't believe that you can make any compelling case for giving that item to an officer, uh, because we shouldn't be in that business. Police officers should not receive a benefit. I mean, it's better to throw the thing away than to create an ethical issue of giving something to someone that they shouldn't have, that they've only received because of their service as an officer. I mean, that might be a little bit of a soapbox, but I feel pretty strongly about that. James says the duck is good, and he will post on Facebook. So there we have it. That might be the most critical thing or critical knowledge that we've received is the ducks are doing well. There's one question. Yeah, just last thing about the test: 30 questions, multiple choice. Shouldn't take you very long. It's these aren't tricky questions, but then again, I wrote them, so I didn't find them tricky. Yeah, I knew exactly what I was thinking when I wrote the test and exactly what I intended the correct answer to be. So that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be slightly confusing. But again, if there are issues with the test, I'm not opposed to changing the test or looking at answers. I mean, you can protest. It's a free class and a free test, but that doesn't mean it should be a bad experience. So I feel strongly that we can make this test better. We can improve this process, and I'm certainly willing to do that. I think that is it. I think those are all the answers or all the questions that I was able to find. Just thank you for being here. We're going to wrap this up now, and I'm going to hit the little end button. But thanks for your participation. I hope to see most of you back on June 11th for the evidence show. We'll be talking about between now and normal, reopening after a pandemic. And since I know James is still listening, I would love for one of the next ones to be just James Nally on fentanyl and discussing fentanyl issues and exposure issues, because it's not just COVID that we have to worry about. I mean, my sister has COVID. I just found out yesterday, and she's actually in the hospital. So that's kind of a scary thing. Other than that, it hadn't affected me personally. But, you know, fentanyl exposure is real and will continue to be a real hazard even after this pandemic is over. When they find a cure for COVID or when they have a vaccine for COVID, fentanyl will still be a real, clear, and present danger for law enforcement, for evidence custodians. So exposure risks are going to continue. They will be different, but the protections and the protocols are going to be fairly consistent over time. So I think that is it. And I appreciate prayers for your sister. And yes, there is an absolute money back guarantee for this course. I promise you will be refunded the full purchase price of this training if you are not completely satisfied. And again, I'd hate to stop and shut this thing off if there was someone in Fiji or a beach somewhere that wanted to host a class. Or really anywhere else in the country, but specifically Fiji. Just let me know. Have a great day. Thanks for being here, and I will see you on June 11th for the first episode of the most magnetic hour in evidence management, the Evidence Show. All right, now I'm really going to click that little red button. Have a great day.